We have now arrived at Thyatira, an inland town about 60 miles northeast of Smyrna. I remember that one of Paul's first converts on the continent of Europe was Lydia, a seller of purple from Thyatira. Our visit here may be a little disappointing because there's not much to be seen of that ancient New Testament city, even less than at Smyrna. And the reason is the same. This town lies buried under the modern Turkish town of Akhisar. One small area right in the middle of Akhisar has been excavated, and the archaeologists have found the ruins of only two interesting buildings, a temple of Apollo and a church built in honor of John.
These ruins are from the temple of Apollo all around us. Now, Apollo was worshipped here for a long time, but we don't know what the temple was like because on the site later many buildings were constructed. Also, the Church of St. John was constructed here at the 6th century AD.
None of the walls or columns of the Temple of Apollo are still standing, but many column drums and marble fragments are scattered around, and these show that it was an important temple. The archaeologists found arches that had fallen, but instead of restoring them, they have laid them out on the ground. Here's a row of column bases that are still in place on the stylobot. Stylobot is an archaeological term, and it refers to the massive blocks of cut stone that were laid end to end as a foundation for a row of columns. The god Apollo was worshipped in many cities. His most famous temple was at Delphi in Greece, and the people came from all over the world to seek the oracle's advice. The oracle also spoke at the great temple at Didyma, south of Ephesus, that we have already visited.
Apollo is the sun god, actually, but being the sun god, for example, nothing is a secret to him because he can see everything from above. And he is responsible for the oracles, he is responsible for the medical treatment of everybody.
Along with the Temple of Apollo, the archaeologists have found an ancient church. It was built in the 6th century in honor of John. The walls, constructed of brick and stone, are still standing. As we move around the nave, we can see that this was an impressive church building, not as large as Justinian's church at Ephesus, but still impressive for a smaller town like Thyatira. Arched doorways led from the main part of the church into the rooms along the side. This church, like the others that we see in the 7 cities of Asia, was built about 200 years after the Roman persecutions had ended. They show that the Christian faith was very strong in Asia up to the time that the Muslims came in the 7th century. The New Testament has only 2 references to Thyatira, the home of Lydia in Acts 16 and the letter here in Revelation, but we have many other sources of information about the city. We know that trade guilds were very important here, and these guilds were the basis for the city's prosperity. We learn from inscriptions that there were trade guilds for potters and bakers, for wool merchants, for metal workers, even for slave traders. The city was famous for dyeing purple cloth, and this may explain why Lydia, whose home was here, was a seller of purple in Philippi. In the Lord's letter, he referred to himself as the one whose feet were like burnished bronze. The Greek word for burnished bronze has not been found anywhere else, and this may be a reference to the guild for metal workers here in Thyatira. These trade guilds posed some very serious problems for the Christians who lived here. If a Christian was going to work in a guild, he might be forced to go along with all of its activities, including immoral fertility rites and even sacrifices to pagan gods. But if he refused to go along with the guild's activities, he might be without a job. As the church struggled with this problem, some of them favored compromise. They said that even though Jesus was their Lord, still it would be all right to go along with the pagan sacrifices. This party was led by a woman called Jezebel, and she comes in for some of the strongest criticism anywhere in Revelation. Thyatira was the least important of the 7 cities, but the letter to the church here was the longest. Why did the Lord have so much to say to this church?
The letter to Thyatira is interesting because it has a mixed message. Jesus begins by praising the church and commending the church for their love and their faith and their service and patient endurance and the fact that their later works are better than their first works. The central problem in Revelation was one of compromising one's faith. In this letter to Thyatira, Jesus condemns the church there for tolerating a Jezebel-type woman who taught the church to compromise their faith by committing adultery and eating food offered to idols. Christians today can learn much from this church. The Church of Jesus cannot afford to compromise its faith with a secular mind and sensual immorality. Jesus tells us that his eyes are like a flaming fire. He can see through our insincerity and the spiritual veneer that we sometimes hide behind. When we are tempted to go along with our immoral culture, we must renew our faith in Jesus and his moral standards. For if we vacillate and compromise, then we deny him.
Jesus.